So in the past year or so, we've been building our own expedition camper from scratch. And along the way, we've definitely learned a lot of things about how to do it and kind of the failures along the way. We wanted to make a video kind of dedicated to just kind of going through some general tips for making a camper yourself. Some of the most helpful videos I've watched on YouTube have kind of been similar to this. So hopefully there's something interesting you can find in here, or just listen to me talk for no reason for the next 10 minutes. The first one, and probably the most important, is it's going to take a really, really long time. I remember before getting into the project, I mean, I knew it was a big project, but once you actually get into the weeds of things, it really is incredible how long every single step takes. Even if you're looking at something simple like just paint the camper white or paint this aluminum trim white, the amount of steps just to get there, like prepping, cleaning your area, putting up a paint booth, every single step has so many sub-steps. So no matter what, it's going to take a really long time. I'll link a video in the description from a fellow YouTuber, Bruce and Krista, that talks about this, but it's just not possible to have a good, fast, cheap camper. Either you're going to have to sacrifice some things and maybe not do it so fancy or do it simpler, or you're going to have to pay someone a lot of money. But you really can't have it all, and that's kind of one of the things we've had to accept along the way. The next thing is to expect to make mistakes. I'm definitely a pretty extreme perfectionist when it comes to things, and I want everything to be absolutely perfect with the camper. And one of the dilemmas that I've kind of ran into is you really can't get things perfect the first time. No matter what, there's going to be something you want to do differently, and you can kind of go down that rabbit hole over and over and over. And there's been plenty of things along the way where we've kind of, scrapped one idea or one design and went a different direction. But for the most part, if this is your first build or even your second build, you're really just going to have to accept to be making a lot of mistakes along the way. You can always strive for perfection, but you're definitely not going to get there. And that's something that can be hard to accept. Yeah, it's literally a catch-22. It's impossible to get it right the first time. The only way to get it perfect is to make the mistakes in the first place so you know what not to do. That doesn't happen all the time, but I'd say the majority of the time, that's what happens. Relating to our first point about how much time it's going to take, when you're budgeting how much time you think something's going to take, expect to be making all of the mistakes all of the time. And then you might just have an accurate time frame. Building for the trip. That's a big thing I think a lot of people miss, is you definitely want to build your camper for the trips you plan on going on. That doesn't mean your camper can't work for multiple trips, but definitely think about what you actually want to do with your vehicle. For example, there's a lot of people that I've seen who build these very extravagant vans only for to go on a weekend trip. If you want to do that, that's great, but I think for a lot of people, that's kind of the wrong path. And, along those lines, you don't need a fancy camper to go camping. You can camp out of any physical vehicle you have, whether it's a bicycle, your own legs, or a car. Before we had this vehicle, we had a SUV that we built out and camped out of. And before that, we had a Mazda hatchback. Anyways, definitely keep your trip in mind. I mean, for example, if we were going to go on a cross-country trip and for some reason we were meeting some friends in New York City or on the East Coast, we would definitely bring the Mazda. It drives fast, it gets really good gas mileage, and it's just an easy, cheap car to drive. Separate of the cost of gas, the operating cost of that vehicle is just way cheaper. When you have, a vehicle you've built out, every single mile you put on that vehicle is a lot more costly. For example, in our truck, the suspension isn't cheap, and every mile you put on that suspension is wearing it out. If those miles are on a trip, that's great. A trip that's appropriate for the vehicle, that's great. But definitely, don't get too wrapped up in your vehicle and build for the trip that you're going on. Along those lines, my friend's dad, who's kind of the person that got us into overlanding and camping like this, one of his best pieces of advice was the best upgrade to a rig is a daily. And that's one of the things that's really stuck with me, is when you're building out a vehicle very quickly, it's easy to get wrapped up in the idea of it being a commuter and it actually, being your daily driver. For some people, that's all you can do. But pretty soon, once you've started to invest some money into your camper, it's going to be way cheaper for you to buy, a $4,000 beater Honda Civic and commute with that instead of commuting with your rig that drives horrible on the street with its long travel and gets 2 miles per gallon. Something else we've learned kind of along the lines of other stuff we've mentioned so far is definitely learn the limitations of the space you're working in. We started this project in a tiny one-car shack, essentially. It was built in the 1920s, completely uninsulated. It flooded with water all the time. It was just horrible construction, and it was absolutely tiny. So the vehicle barely fit in there. Once we actually put the box on the vehicle, even before the lift and tires and everything, it just didn't fit anymore. So what we ended up doing is actually taking the tires off of the rims just to get it to roll in there. A lot of kind of the hardest and most complicated parts of the project were done in the beginning and were done in that tiny space. And the reason why I'm mentioning it is it definitely is possible to do it in a tiny space, but, you know, at the cost of your sanity and oftentimes time, because there was a lot of workarounds we had to do just based on the amount of space we had to do the project. Since then, we're now in a larger, like 3-car garage. In my mind, it was the perfect space, and I thought it would be everything I wanted and more, and it is 20 times better than what we were dealing with before. But even now, having a much bigger space would be really helpful. Definitely think out what you're outsourcing. Certain things may actually be more cost effective to not do yourself, just based on the space you have, the tools you have, and what you're currently working with. But no matter what, don't get discouraged. You can do anything, even in a tiny space. I definitely recommend learning how to weld before starting a big project like this. If you're in the same position as I was and didn't really have great welding skills, or maybe haven't welded at all, it's definitely worth taking the time to learn that skill before building a lot of things. I basically would kind of go down the rabbit hole of like how to do this without welding, or how to do this without welding. Welding definitely isn't the solution to everything, but in a lot of ways, I think it is the gatekeeper skill to building your own camper. I definitely recommend just taking the time, learning it. It will pay off, save you time, money, everything in the long run. I don't want to go too in depth into like what kind of welder to get or how to do it. And I'm definitely one of the worst people to be taking welding advice from, but what I can say is it's a lot easier than you think. If you can operate a hot glue gun, you can MIG weld. If you can write with a pencil while tapping on a table, you can TIG weld. Most people recommend you get a MIG welder. I actually would recommend the opposite and get a TIG welder. I didn't initially go with a TIG welder because I thought it was a lot more difficult, and in some ways it definitely is, but I've kind of found it to be a lot more precise, and you can get things kind of fine-tuned, and it can be a lot more predictable. As for what welders to get, both of my welders are from Prime Weld. They're pretty affordable. There's some machine you can grow into, and they really work great. That's what I would recommend. Definitely do your research, and there's plenty of great videos on YouTube on how to weld. You should definitely get a 3D printer. We're going to make a completely separate video deep diving into all the uses for a 3D printer and kind of talking through it, just because it's kind of been a mind-blowing addition to our workflows. But at a high level, I highly recommend getting a 3D printer. One of the things we ran into is we were trying to weld this piece of 2-inch diameter tube to this piece of 1-inch diameter tube. And the problem is, if you try to do this flat on a table, you essentially have to find a way to prop up the smaller diameter tube. It kind of becomes hard to get everything square, 90 degrees. So what I did is 3D printed or designed and then 3D printed these little spacers here. And this one's for the 1-inch block, and this one's for the 2-inch block. And essentially what these do is hold the different diameter blocks at effectively the same height relative to the table. So went like that, and then you put the other tube like that, and then now they are perfectly at the exact same height. And it made fitment and welding 10 times easier. This is just, one example. There's been hundreds of uses along the way that have been just like this. These pieces, you do not have to be a master in design to make something like this. It probably takes, 5-10 minutes to design, another 20-30 minutes to print, and probably, it's hard to tell, but a piece of plastic like this only costs a few cents to print.
Just pull it in a little bit further.
Towards me?
Towards you, yeah.
Okay. Another cool use we ran into earlier in the build, we'll overlay some footage of this, is we needed to install our floor, and essentially what we did is we lowered it from the ceiling, and the problem was we had to keep a little bit of a gap between the edge of the bottom frame and the floor. That way the wall panel could slot in. And it was really hard because the floor was really heavy, and we had to hoist it down to actually get it to fall into position. So once we, laid down the glue, we didn't want to have to worry about having to move this because it just wouldn't move. So what I did was 3D print these little spacer block things. How they worked is it clipped onto the side here, just like that. And then as we were lowering the floor, it essentially was able to self-center and then land exactly where we wanted to. So we did a bunch of these along the side and then did some along the other side, and it worked out perfect. Lastly, the tip we wanted to finish on, and probably the most important, is to take everybody's advice online with a grain of salt. And sadly, that does include my advice, but one of the things, there's a lot of really bad advice on the internet, and it's honestly mind-blowing how people who have so little knowledge on a subject will just decide to post on a forum or make a YouTube video talking about something. There was a lot of things along the way where before I knew more on the subject, I kind of, trusted something I read or thought someone was knowledgeable, and, later found out they were not. And there's definitely, I've kind of learned some forums to avoid when you're building your own camper. Sorry to call some of these out because, I'm on these too. But for example, like the Sprinter, ProMaster, Transit forums, even if you are building out one of these vehicles, and I think they're all awesome platforms, for their own reasons, be very careful in those forums. There's a lot of people just giving absolutely horrible advice on things they're doing, how they're building. Moral of the story, definitely take everyone's advice with a grain of salt. There is a lot of bad advice out there, and just because you read something on the internet or listen to some dude with a microphone talk about it doesn't mean it is true. Anyways, we hope you really enjoyed this video. Sorry we have not been posting very frequently. We're definitely going to try to make an effort to post more often. It's not going to be that often because, we also have to build a camper. And along with tip number 1, if you want it to take less time, don't film yourself trying to build it. Or try to give advice while you build it and you don't know shit. We have a lot of exciting videos coming up. Right after this, we're actually going to test our new pop-top design. Hope to have a couple videos about that. But anyways, hope you enjoyed watching, and see you in the next video.